The Liberation of Sundrian City by Andrew Lewis. Chapter 27. Inside a Break. I can't say I agree with it, no. But surely you can see something must be done. Linus, Almond looked on him with sadness in his regarding. There is nothing that can be done. Over my many years I've learned to stay out of the political matters of the palace. We can't change the decisions made by the Emperor. It was almost as if Almond knew what Linus had planned. Missy lay not far away, still shackled to his spot. His breath was heaving in and out, as if, even as he rested, he was furious and frustrated. The barn was fairly empty, only one elephant choosing to stay indoors, the others all out celebrating the warmth of the night air. Linus had noticed a few elephants on his walk to the barn, and this had pleased him, for finding an elephant in the gardens was one element of his plan that hinged on luck, and apparently his luck was in. Still, he fretted about the weakest link in what was already a fairly feeble plan, the part in which he killed the dungeon guard with a short sword. He held hope that it would be the same guard that beat him on the day he was captured. This way he would feel less guilt on the deed. We'll use Mott tomorrow, if it pleases you. Linus shook from his reverie. Yes, that will be fine. He didn't sound pleased, however. He was toying with the idea of spilling the beans to Almond, telling him of his plan for the night. But he couldn't justify it. It was unnecessary. He feared that Almond would offer assistance and deemed it unfair to drag Almond into his deadly scheme. Further, Linus wanted to go about the plan on his own. He only trusted himself to not draw attention to the escape. More conspirators only meant more chance of being found out. So instead, Linus decided to spend a little more time with Almond, knowing full well that it might be the last time they met. As the conversation wound on, there was an air of sorrow between them. Linus was sure that Almond was, in a way, aware of what Linus wanted to try. It's crept along the streets for too long now, Linus, he mused. The doubt, the curiosity, too many of us question the outside world. I fear that, soon enough, we will see our great wall crumble. It's inevitable, I suppose. Nothing lasts forever. Linus only nodded in response. You see the tethering pegs, Linus? Those pegs in the ground in the dressing stables? Do you ever wonder how something so small could hold a beast like Mott in his place? I mean, he could tear that peg out of the ground in one shot. Linus looked at the tethering pegs, noticing for the first time how easily they could be pulled out. So why don't they just pull them out? Because they cannot. And they cannot because they do not believe they can. You see, from the time these elephants were born, we tethered them to those pegs to clean and dress them. They do indeed try to pull out the pegs when they are young. They all do, believe me. But only as broods. They tried and tried from the moment you tethered them, but alas, were too weak. And so they grew up believing that those pegs were immovable. And now, in their adulthood, they still believe it. And simply because they have never bothered to test the belief again. They continue to believe they are bound, and so they are. Linus looked at the pegs again, and then to Missy, chained and bound with reinforced restraints. Well, what about Missy? Why does he need all his shackles and chains? Ah, a good point, Linus, he said with a smile, as if proud of his student. As you know, Missy is in musts, and for an elephant in musts, regular pegs and chains will never do. You see, musts gives him purpose, musts gives him passion. If we want something bad enough, we will challenge everything we can to get it, even our own selves. In Missy's case, it is a mate that he desires. But passion can be born of many desires, Linus, even just a desire for freedom. A desire for freedom, Linus repeated to himself, walking back toward the palace. He'd said goodbye in such a way that if Almond hadn't already guessed that Linus was planning something, he certainly knew now. There was a strong, sorrowful tone to the word as it came, which surprised Linus as it happened. He hadn't expected it to sound so dramatic as it had. Almond's response had been as bad, but bad in another way. His goodbye was said with a warm smile that seemed to say, "I understand," without the words. Elephants still loomed in the corners of the gardens. He thought he could see Mott, just a huddled mass of blackness by the wall. He gripped at his short sword, sheathed at his waist, and with the action came a rush of nervousness at the prospect of what he would do once he reached his destination, the dungeon. As the nerves hit him, he released the sheath out of instinct and tried to think about something else, anything else. But that was cowardice. He had already caught himself out. This was no time to be a coward. He again gripped the sheath harder and forced himself calmness. He thought on loop about the moment of killing the guard. He imagined it over and again, each time expanding the details, changing the moment to all possible outcomes in which he emerged the victor, and none in which he didn't. Confidence, that's what he needed. And so he strode confidently on, down the halls, turning darker and darker and cooler as he descended winding stairs, until all too soon he found himself arriving at the feet of the guard on post outside the dungeon. He'd neglected this detail, the guard outside, forgotten all about it. Or was this a new security measure? The man posed no immediate threat. In fact, for a guard, he couldn't be less threatening. He sat at the door, with his gangly legs sticking out into the corridor haphazardly. His sheathed short sword was acting as a pillar, holding up his hands, and his head hung down to his chest. If he wasn't asleep, he was very nearly there. He squinted up at Linus and hung his head back down when he saw who it was. "I'm here with a message for..." The guard waved a hand dismissively, as if to say, "I don't need to know the details." It was clear to Linus that he was permitted to pass, but he did not pass. He hesitated a moment, took a step, and then second-guessed himself. The guard looked up again. "Is there a problem? You may enter." "Of course," Linus agreed. He strode confidently to the door, put his hand to the handle, and stopped. "It's right now," he reminded himself. No more hesitation. And in that moment he drew his short sword, turned, and lunged towards the guard. But the strike was deflected by the still-sheathed sword of the guard, who gasped in surprise as he scurried backwards and to his feet. "What is..." Linus lunged again, hoping to get in the kill before the guard could draw his weapon. But he was again deflected, parried by the thick leather of the sheath, and the attack was countered with a firm swing to Linus's jaw. He never felt himself hit the floor. Next he knew, he was being dragged up to his feet and through the door to the dungeon. "Cresworth, this one just attacked me." Linus knew he must regain composure as soon as possible. There was no time to be confused. His life depended on his ability to think clearly. His thoughts swirled around his head and he saw the dungeon guard, through a blur, stand from his desk. Bottles clinked as he stood. He moved crabwise to where Linus stood and announced, "You again? I know this boy." The voice told Linus two things: that it was the same guard as he had met here once before, and that he was drunk. He was thrust forward by his arms, which were pinned behind his back, and saw his short sword be handed to the dungeon guard. "You drew this at me, almost had me too, didn't you, you prick? But do you think just anyone guards the dungeons? I'm the best swordsman in the palace." Cresworth, the drunken guard, scoffed. "Heck you are. You're the laziest guard in the palace, I'll give you that." "Bah, well, I defeated this little worm in my sleep just now. Didn't even draw my blade." "What shall we do with him then?" Linus heard the blade draw from its sheath, felt it creep along his side and to his neck, and he swallowed hard. "No, not that," declared the guard. "No blades." The blade stayed put for the moment. "Leave him with me. Go and tell Deimos about this." The guard lowered his blade, and Linus could sense his disappointment. Cresworth grabbed Linus around the forearm and took him. Possessed by a will to see his plan work, Linus thrashed from Cresworth's grip, lunging for a wine bottle. For a brief moment he felt that he was free from the grip, and his body jolted with excitement, his hand extending towards the empty wine bottle, the very weapon he was now sure would secure his victory. But alas, he was yanked downward to the ground before his hand could close around it. He curled into a ball, heard the excitement of the guards closing in on him, and with a resonant thump to his head, he blacked out. Linus knew which room he was in before he opened his eyes. The darkness, dampness, and lingering mould smell. He could feel a metal shackle on his wrist and decided, for the moment, not to open his eyes, but rather to cradle his head in his hands. He heard the clinking of chains on stone from across the room and remembered the other prisoners, the princess, and as he remembered, he heard her speak in whispered hysterics. "Quickly! Oh, I knew you would come, I knew it. He's dead, Goresh, he died. He died right here. And Linus came. I don't understand what happened, but he has to come with us." Linus struggled up to his knees. "I came to rescue you," he murmured, although the words were hardly intelligible. "Linus, you fool, what happened? Why did you come here?" I came for you, Robin. I had a plan, but..." "Goresh, his chains. A plan? Was this part of your plan?" Goresh moved to Linus and unlocked his shackle with the guard's keys. He took Linus by the forearm and raised him gently to his feet, and grasping him by the shoulders, peered into his eyes in a way that either said, "You are okay," or asked, "Are you okay?" It was impossible to tell which. "I'm okay," he nodded, although he felt anything but okay. He was still struggling to understand just what was happening around him. Scanning the room, Linus saw the unmoving corpse of another prisoner tethered to the wall by chains. Light flooded the room from the open door to the antechamber, and without thought, he moved towards it, towards freedom. As he passed the princess, she knocked him on the shoulder and smiled briefly, as if he weren't already dizzy enough. Sitting at his desk, seemingly unconscious in a drunken slumber, Cresworth rested among several empty bottles. It took Linus a moment to recognise that he was not in fact sleeping, but dead. With a buzz of satisfaction, he reached over the body and took back his short sword from amongst the bottles. At the foot of the dungeon door, the other guard sat at his usual post, propped against the wall, his sword clasped in his hand. Linus looked to Goresh with awe, impressed by the man's work. There was not a spot of blood on either guard, and any onlooker would assume they were sleeping, even at close inspection. True, anyone who journeyed to these depths of the palace would be looking to enter the dungeon and would soon realise that they were dead, but still, the work was masterful. Linus suddenly remembered the events of before he was knocked unconscious, and in a panic turned to Goresh. "This man, he was about to go tell Deimos about my capture. Where did you find him?" Goresh pointed at the corridor in which they stood, making a running gesture with his fingers. "He was leaving this room? Did he get a chance to..." Goresh shook his head and gave the OK sign, and Linus breathed a sigh of relief. "So what now?" asked Princess Robin. The question wasn't directed at Linus, but he responded regardless. "I've got a plan." The heads of both his accomplices swiveled in surprise to hear that Linus, the boy covered in his own blood and swaying dizzily as he stood, was still confident in his own plan. He surprised himself too. He was unsure of himself, but persisted. Confidence was what he had sworn he would maintain until he died trying. And he wasn't dead yet. He'd been reminded of this somehow in the way that Goresh had picked him up and set him on his feet. It was done in such a way that suggested they were equal as men, both warriors, both fighting to save the princess. "You have to trust me. I can get us out of the palace walls." "And how do you suppose we do that?" "Well, it should be easy. We can leave the same way that I got into the palace walls." "Easy? Are you mad? This coming from a boy who thought he could wander into the dungeon and defeat 2 guards. Well, to be fair, I was only expecting 1 guard. And that was the hard part of my plan. And although it didn't turn out quite as I'd hoped, the outcome is the same. I somehow just knew that it would work out, although I wasn't sure how. Now I know that I can get us out of here. I know it." "So, what is it?" Linus paused a moment before launching into his explanation. It was really almost too simple to take seriously, but at the same time, the genius of the plan was in its simplicity. "We go through the garden, find an elephant, and have it lift us over the wall. Then we sneaked down the outer edge of the palace wall, between the wall and the mountain face of Adela's arm, and then we climbed back over, once we reached the markets or the special residencies. The princess looked at Goresh, who stood perplexed. He eventually shrugged and the princess spoke. Okay. Okay, he said. Goresh, you stay behind in the palace and... No, he will be killed. I don't think so. Listen, we need stealth if we are going to get from the palace to the depths of the city unseen. And no offense to you, Goresh, but I think you would agree that stealth is not your strong suit. But think about it. So far, Goresh isn't implicated in this escape. It might be hours, it might even be tomorrow morning, before it is discovered that you've escaped. At that point, we will likely have the whole army looking for us. Don't you think Goresh could do more good for us as an accomplice, hiding within enemy ranks? The princess looked to Goresh for confirmation, which he gave in a sorrowful nod, and in that moment the princess flung herself at Goresh, wrapping her arms around him. Thank you, Goresh, thank you for everything. Linus shook the man's hand and thanked him too, with a new respect for the person he had once thought was a savage beast. As arranged, Linus and Robin left first, walking quickly but calmly through the corridors. The princess wore her hood and kept her face turned down in case of any passers-by. Goresh waited behind. He was to leave a few minutes later. That way, if something went wrong, he wouldn't be too far behind. If he made it through the corridors without seeing them in trouble, he could be quite sure they'd made it into the gardens without a hitch. As they moved forward along the corridors, every unexpected noise made Linus twitch with fear. He tried to remain calm, but it proved impossible. When a guard crossed the hall up in front of them, Linus stiffened and gasped, terror shooting up his spine. But he kept his stride strong and carried on forth, and so too did the guard, oblivious to what he had just encountered. After a few minutes of seemingly endless terror, they arrived at the door leading to the palace gardens and walked purposefully through the darkness towards the far edge of the palace walls. Mott. The creature stirred from his sleep and was at attention in moments, a loud but inconspicuous snore escaping his mouth. Linus put him into a kneel. Hold, boy. Hold there. He crossed his hands, weaving his fingers into a hoist, and beckoned to the princess to step up. She hurried forth wordlessly and placed a foot on the hold, and as she did, her thigh touched against Linus's cheek, and for a moment his fear of capture, of death, was entirely eclipsed, de-levelled by a new type of fear that made him breathless. He felt the peculiar loss of words that overcomes any man in the throes of such a lust, and for a moment tried to think of something to say, but was glad to remember that there was a distinct need for silence at this point. She weighed more than he expected, probably more than him. It almost would have made more sense to have her hoist him up, but for the fact that Linus could easily mount the beast unassisted. Clutching hard at the stem of the ear, so as to tilt Mott's head sideways, Linus pulled himself up and onto the neck. The three of them approached the wall at the garden's edge, made a bridge to the top with Mott's trunk, and climbed silently up and onto the wall. How far is the drop? I can't see a thing. It shouldn't be far. Not as far as the other side, although a new worry. What if he dropped down onto a rock and broke a bone or twisted an ankle? He scratched a piece of mortar from the wall and dropped it down into the dark crevasse. He saw it vaguely bounce from the ground and lost sight of it. It seemed the drop was small. With a pat on Mott's trunk to say thank you, and no further thought of danger, he lowered himself down the wall, held his breath, and dropped into the darkness between wall and mountain. A moment's weightlessness, and he tumbled into the dirt and came to a rest, relieved at the absence of pain. Lower your legs down to me. Another heart-stopping moment. With every hushed step, their eyes grew more and more accustomed to the darkness, until they could almost tread with certainty that there was no hidden obstacles below. It was a slow trip, each step measured, delicate, in an attempt to be as silent as possible. Linus passed the time by wondering if the dungeons had been found vacant yet, but assumed not. He was sure there would be commotion through the gardens if so. Or then again, perhaps there wouldn't be any commotion. Perhaps Deimos would play his cards close to his chest, give the illusion of security to the escapees, hoping for a reckless slip-up. He made the assumption that Deimos would suspect an accomplice. The princess was unlikely to escape the dungeon without help, but he also doubted that he personally would be a suspect for the part. Deimos wasn't even aware of their friendship. No one was, to the best of Linus's knowledge. Still, soon enough it would be discovered that Linus was missing too, and then surely Deimos would figure it out. The other thought that interrupted his racing mind was a much simpler one, merely thinking about the hand that was clutching his shirt as they made their way through the darkness. That hand, that reliance on him to be a leader, to be a man, was what gave him strength and kept him somewhat calm. She had placed her faith in him, not that she had much choice, mind, but Linus was determined to honour that responsibility to the best of his capability. I guess this is where we cross. His voice pierced the silence, startling him with its resonance. It had been a long while since either of them had spoken. They'd found themselves at a boulder large enough to get them over the wall again and difficult to cross past. Linus didn't recall the boulder from his journey into the palace, although he didn't recall much from that night, but figured they'd be somewhere in the middle of the special residencies, or maybe in the outer ring. The middle-class district, most likely. "Where are we?" asked the princess, apparently thinking along the same lines as Linus. "I don't know, let's find out." Atop the wall they stayed as flat and silent as possible. They were at the far edge of the special residencies. Linus went first, showing the princess how to silently scale the narrow space between a house and the wall. At the ground, he pulled her hood over her head and reminded her, the best way to be inconspicuous is to be natural. There's nothing more suspicious than two people sneaking about in the dark. But where will we go? Linus had thought about this problem too, and wasn't quite satisfied with his conclusion. The truth was, he didn't have any good ideas, so he moved forth with a faux confidence into the only idea he had. "This way. Follow me. Towards the palace. For now, I know someone who can help us. Come on." "Linus, I..." She paused. Fear was audible in her breathless tone. Panic almost. "Okay," she resigned. "I'm behind you."